everyone, and welcome. I'm Paige Sharp with the Indiana Arts Commission. I am in my early 50s and have light brown shoulder length hair, and I'm wearing a patterned blouse. Megan?
And I'm Megan Tulligman with Indiana Humanities. We're so happy you could join us today. I'm in my mid-30s with dark hair, wearing a patterned sweater, and I have a lot of plants in my background.
The crisis of 2020 has challenged many of us to rethink how we lead, create, fundraise, program, and engage with audiences. If the pandemic is a portal, as Arundhati Roy puts it, where do we hope it leads us? How can we reimagine and reinvent our organizations to be more relevant and inclusive?
All great and timely questions. Without further ado, let's dive right in. If you have questions today, we will have time at the end to address those. So you can open up the Q&A window and enter them there. But I'm going to hand it right over to Nina. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Megan. Hello, everybody. I'm Nina Simon. I am almost 40 and have curly hair, and I'm in a very dark place because I'm in Santa Cruz, California, in the mountains in a cabin where it's 7 in the morning, and hopefully the sun will come up and I will be increasingly illuminated as we have this conversation today. Thank you, Paige and Megan, for kicking us off and for hosting us. And just want to reinforce what Megan said. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. And if you have questions for me that you'd like to share there, you can do so. You can also upvote other people's questions there as well. So what's going to happen is I'm going to share a presentation for about 30-40 minutes. Then we'll really dive into wherever you have questions, and we'll be done at the hour. And I am going to start to share my screen. Also, before I do so, I'll just put in the chat that if you want to download the slides, you should see in the chat a link where you'll be able to do so later. Okay, and this slide just has the exact same information. Okay, so I'm honored to be with you today representing Of, By, For All. Of, By, For All is a global nonprofit that works with arts, culture, humanities, and civic organizations all over the world that are striving to become of and by the communities they exist for. And we'll talk a lot more about what that means here today. And for almost the past 20 years, I've spent my career focused on really thinking about and working on how we open up arts and cultural spaces to be welcoming spaces of belonging for all kinds of people in our communities. But I have to admit that even though I've been doing this since I was 21, it's really not what I expected to be doing when I was a little kid thinking about what I wanted to do when I grew up. When I was a kid, I had an entirely different dream. This was my hero. This is Sally Ride, first American woman in space, first lesbian in space as well, although she wasn't out at the time. And when I was about 8 years old and I learned about Sally Ride, I decided that was it. I wanted to work for NASA, and I wanted to be an electrical engineer. Fast forward a few years, and I followed my dream to university to study electrical engineering. And I'll never forget that first time I walked into a lecture hall for a course in my selected major. It was one of those big lecture halls with the aisle down the middle. The room smelled like chalk. And I found my seat. I got out my graphing notebook and I started looking around at my classmates filling the seats around me. There were lots of them, and they had something in common. They were all men. You see, in my electrical engineering program, like most programs then and unfortunately today, women made up a tiny percentage of the student body. In my school, only 1% of the undergraduate students in electrical engineering were women. There were no women graduate students. There were no women professors. In fact, in all the time I spent in electrical engineering, I never met a woman engineer. I put my head down, I worked hard, I graduated with honors, and I went right to that dream job at NASA. And then I quit it just 6 months later. On some level, I felt like I didn't belong. We've all had times when we felt like we didn't belong, when we looked around and we realized how few of us there are and how many of them. Maybe some of you feel that way in the work and the institutions you're working in now. That feeling of not belonging is powerful. It's a feeling that led me to abandon a dream I'd had since I was a little girl. But it's also a feeling that drove me to adopt a new dream, a dream that brings me here to you and to arts and culture and humanities today. And that's the dream that we can create places where all kinds of people could feel like they belong. I took that dream and that energy into museums, and about 8 years ago became the director of this museum, the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz, California. And at the time that I started at the museum, we were really struggling. Fortunately, we were not facing a pandemic, but unfortunately, we had some pretty serious issues on our hands. The first was money. We didn't have any. The day I walked in the door as the new director, we had $16,000 in the bank, we had $36,000 in unpaid bills, and there was no magic check coming on the horizon. At the same time, though, we had an even bigger problem, and that was a problem of relevance. There were more people in Santa Cruz who knew this building used to be the county jail than knew it was now a museum. And it had been a museum at this point for almost 20 years. And in this context of financial and relevance crisis, the board was spurred to act. And inside that boardroom, this is the question people were asking. How do we get new people in here? How do we get them involved, not just as visitors, but as volunteers, as donors, as partners? How do we get younger people? How do we get people of color? How do we get people who've never walked in these doors before? I understood this question, but it also made me uneasy. I realized I'd heard a version of this question before. I'd heard it in engineering when people would say this: how do we get more girls in here? I've come to believe that these are the wrong questions to ask. I believe these questions lead us to lazy and judgmental answers. In engineering, people would say things like this, maybe girls just aren't cut out for it. And in arts and culture spaces, I've heard people say this: maybe those people just don't appreciate culture. Maybe those people just aren't interested in what we have. People have said these things to my face for years. And at our little museum in Santa Cruz, we decided to ask different questions, not about them on the outside, but about us. We decided to ask, what are we willing to change to welcome new people? What are we willing to change to help new people belong? And before I tell you what we did, I just want to invite you to think about the fact that if your organization is closed or operating in a different manner right now, now is a great time to ask these questions. Now is a time to ask, when we reopen or when we reopen fully, who do we want to be there with us? Who do we want to be at our doors or at our performances or in our conversations who wasn't with us before? And what could we change? What are we willing to change right now to make that future possible? At the museum, we decided to change in 3 ways to become of, by, and for our community. We really wanted to become a community-driven space, a space that people felt was theirs. And so we focused on thinking about representation, so that when people walked into the museum, they saw stories of our community, they saw staff members who were representative of the diversity of our community, and board members as well. We focused a lot on partnership, so that programs were not just created by our staff, but were created and co-created by community members, sharing their own stories, sharing their own history, sharing their own art, both in the museum and outside in the case of this Surf History project. And finally, it led us to becoming for that wide diversity of our community and that larger group of people than we had been able to connect with before. People who were coming to experience art and history in a new way, who were coming to make connections across differences in age, gender, race, and economics in the museum space. This change was philosophical, but it also fundamentally changed the business of our museum. When I walked into the museum in May of 2011, this is what our situation looked like. We had a shaky budget of $700,000, no reserves, 7 staff members, and 17,000 visitors per year, the majority of whom were older white retirees and school children. This is what it looked like for my last full year at the museum. We'd increased our budget and built a reserve. We greatly increased our staff, and our attendance had gone up 9x. And these attendees, these visitors now reflected the age diversity of our county, the income diversity of our county, and the racial diversity of our city. We're proud of this transformation and fundamentally went looking for the pattern within it. And we believe this is the pattern, that the way we were able to be for so many more people was by becoming of and by them. That when we were representative of our community, when our programs were created by our community, it made us a space that was welcoming for people who had not felt welcome before, because they weren't just being welcomed by us or by the programming and the ideas in our head. They were being welcomed by their neighbors, by their friends, by artists who represented and spoke to their experience as well. And so this is kind of our playbook when we think about what it means to be of, by, and for a community. And we see that every organization is different. Some organizations are very strong in partnerships on by, but they want to work on shifting who's on their board and staff in of. Some have really worked on accessibility in for, but may not have done as much on the of and by side. I would actually suggest that many of our organizations pre-pandemic did a lot of work in the last 20 years on for, a lot of work thinking about how people could feel comfortable in our spaces. And perhaps now, post-pandemic, as we're moving into that space, we could think about how we could shift and build some attention on the of and the by side as well. So now I'm part of this global nonprofit that helps organizations make these kinds of changes. Right now, we're working with 75 organizations in 11 countries in this program called the Change Network, which is a year-long program for organizations striving to make these shifts to become of and by communities who have not been involved in the past. We work with museums, but we also work with parks, we work with choruses, we work with libraries, we work with history centers, we work with historic houses. Some of the organizations we work with are tiny, with 1 or no staff, and some of them have hundreds of staff members. And what we see, though, is that all of them are working to become more inclusive and equitable. All of them are striving to make changes to how they work, to become of and by the people they want to be for. And that might look like celebrating together across diasporic cultures at the Immigration Museum in Australia. It might look like really creating a welcoming space for Somali immigrant families in Minnesota. It might look like partnering with homeless adults and opera singers to co-produce opera in London at Streetwise Opera. Or it might look like getting outside together in public land across our differences, across gang affiliations with the County Parks Friends in Watsonville, California. And what we have heard again and again from the organizations we're working with is this. They said, you know, we thought we were doing things that were of and by our community, but we found that like most nonprofits, we were doing things for them rather than asking our community if they were serving them in the best way. We were assuming instead of asking, and we were doing instead of partnering, and we weren't getting very far. We were doing one-off programs. We were doing events where a lot of people would come and then never come back. We were having partnerships that were very rich for one exhibition and then wasted away. And what we've seen again and again is the organizations we're working with are working to build relationships that last and that are generative beyond one program or one event or one initiative. And really fundamentally what's happening here is a shift from an institution first approach where we come up with the ideas and we figure out who to sell them to a community first approach where we say who matters most to our future, how can we learn what matters to them, how can we figure out how that aligns with our mission and our capabilities and build that into what we do. So I'd love to show you an example from Indiana, from the Change Network. And this is an example from the St. Joseph County Public Library there in South Bend. They were one of the earliest members of our first wave of the Change Network in 2018, and we've been honored to support them for almost 3 years now. And they really started with this question. They said, how can we ensure that everyone in our community feels like this library, our public library, is for them? And they acknowledged that while there's been a lot of demographic shift in St. Joseph County, the library was still mostly serving a white community that had been involved with the library and loving the library for a long time. And they decided that where they wanted to focus was on Latinx youth and families, specifically on the west side of South Bend, where they knew that there were a lot of people who they thought there was possibility to work with, but who they didn't have deep relationships with already. So they went out and listened and learned from their community. And one of the first things they heard was, hey, one of the things that's important for us to feel welcome is bilingual programming, especially if you're going to be doing multi-generational events. We need something that everybody in our family, from the abuela, the grandma, to the kid, can be part of. So one of the small things they started with was some translation, both around some particular programs and also supporting all their front desk staff and security staff in learning really basic Spanish. And this was not about them being able to have deep, fully bilingual programs, although I think they hope to go there, but it was about being able at the door, when you walk in, even before you walk in, when you see a sign, to have a signal that the library is ready to meet you where you are, as opposed to expecting you to fully integrate into their culture. They also heard from some of the moms they talked to about a desire to do story time and about an excitement about it. And one of the things they decided to do, which was really smart, was to do bilingual story time, not with librarians always running the stories, but in partnership with local storytellers from the Latinx community. Those partners had credibility and trust in a way that the librarians might not have. And it started to build some relationships between librarians and Latinx storytellers, but also invited more Latinx families to get involved more quickly. And this is a model they're now looking at for programming in other languages as well. But perhaps even more important, you might think, bilingual signage, story time, sure, that seems kind of obvious. What's most important is what they learned from their partners that they didn't expect. This is one of the partners they met. This is a man named Juan who works for La Casa de Amistad, which is a community center on the west side of South Bend. And one of the things that he brought up when they met with him to hear what mattered most to him and his community was he brought up the need for documentation and for ID. And he said, the city has this ID card program, the South Bend ID, that lets people who may not have a federal or state ID get a local ID so they can get some local services. And this is really valuable to our community, but they're kind of onerous to get. And when he brought this up, the librarians were like, oh, we can sign people up for South Bend ID at the library, but we don't usually have those forms out because most people don't need them, and we don't have those forms in Spanish. And they decided to partner together at Latinx festivals. Librarians would come out, have a booth where they could sign you up for a South Bend ID in Spanish, and they could also sign you up for a library card if you wanted one. And in their first times out, they signed up dozens of people for ID cards and library cards. Now, in the context of a big county and a big library system, signing up 40 something or 60 something people at an event may not sound like a lot. But these are all people who didn't just do an activity with the library. They got value from the library. They got something that mattered to them from the library. And they started potentially to see the library as an entity with whom they could have a relationship where they could get more value over time. And then finally, all of this work on the by and the for side, building those partnerships, led the library to really feel like they wanted to increase representation on the of side. They started by focusing on creating a pathway for paid internships for Latinx youth to be able to work in the library. They've been on a hiring freeze right now during COVID, but one of the things they're working on right now is reformatting all their job descriptions so that when new jobs become available and the hiring freeze is lifted, they're able to get more candidates who are coming from the Latinx community and other communities who haven't been as represented on their staff in the past. So this is kind of the journey they went on in their first year in the program, but they've continued to deepen their partnerships. And perhaps one of the most amazing stories that's come out of South Bend is that the library's funding was threatened a couple of years ago, maybe only a year and a half ago, right before the pandemic. They were going to lose about $1 million in their funding to another resource in the county. And a lot of library supporters came out, as they always would, to say, hold the library funding, save the library funding. But one of the things that was also special was some of their new partners came out as well. Because these relationships were not just transactional. They were not just for one project. They were relationships that were about building together and doing something that makes the whole community feel supported, feel served, and feel like the library really is for them. So that's just one example of what this looks like in practice. For every organization we're working with, I could share a different example. Some are diving deep into racial equity issues. Some are diving into healing past trauma with communities who have not felt welcome in the past. And some are building relationships out of curiosity, maybe with neighboring communities who they haven't gotten to know yet. And what we hear again and again from the folks we work with is they say, we started with this desire, we started with this hunger to become more inclusive and equitable and relevant, but we didn't know how to do it. And we try and be very practical in saying, our goal, you bring the why, we bring a how to support you in figuring out how you're going to move forward. Now, you might be wondering, during COVID, during a time of Black Lives Matter, how could we focus on this? Why does this matter right now? Now, my guess is every single one of you has a different answer to this question. Some of you probably feel like now is a rare moment to focus on these issues of inclusion and equity in particular that we maybe have not focused on in the past. But some of you may also feel like it is an exhausting moment, when it is an impossible moment, when we just need to be able to take care of each other and ourselves and wait for things to get better. But I would really suggest to you, and Paige used that quote from Arundhati Roy, that we are in this portal time. And if we just wait for things to get better, they will not get better. They'll get worse. I really believe that now is an opportunity for us to make some changes in how we approach things, how we approach people, so that we're leading to building more inclusive, equitable, and really loved spaces. So what I want to do, since I'm a very practical person, I'm still an engineer at heart, and our program is rooted in how, is I want to give you some really tangible hows to get started, whether you do so in a program like ours or not. So I want to walk through the way that we really support and encourage teams to make change in your organization if you're fired up and ready to do this. And again, you're welcome to join our Change Network. We're recruiting now for a cohort that will start in April, but you also can do this work on your own. So the first thing we encourage you to do is to form a team, a change team. You can't make change alone. You need others. And we encourage you, if you can, to form a diagonal team, which means people horizontally in different departments or areas, but also at different levels of power. People who come from different areas and different levels of power have different perspectives. They also have different assets to bring to change. You do not need everybody to be on board with change to be able to get it started. In fact, if you try for that, you will never get started. 3, 4, 8 people, whatever it is, who are eager and ready to work together from across different parts of your organization, so the work can't get siloed or marginalized. Then we encourage you to create a vision, to imagine a kind of destination that you want to head to. Sometimes people call this a destination postcard. It can just be a sketch, but a sense of, if we were wildly successful, what could be possible? Because this work is long and it's nuanced and it's very, can be slow at times. And so it's useful to have a vision of where you're going. If you're going to build a cathedral, you have a sketch and then you start building little bricks. So start with your vision. That's something you can sell, you can get stakeholders involved with, you can build energy around, even as you start doing the work. And from our perspective, doing the work really starts with picking a community that you're going to focus on first. This is often impossible, or it feels impossible, especially if you're in a big community. You may feel like there are so many communities who we have not engaged. How could we possibly pick one? And what we really say is, if you don't pick one, you're basically setting out a buffet and saying, hey, everybody, come on in. If you pick one, you're inviting somebody to dinner and you're saying, I want to get to know you and I want to maybe form a relationship so we can do something together. And buffets work for some things and they work for some people, but particularly if you want to work with a community who has not felt welcome, maybe who has felt exploited or harmed or distanced from what you do, putting attention and intention into that relationship will lead you places you could never go with a buffet. And so then we, offer and encourage you to use a lot of tools to just listen and learn, to not jump into saying, okay, what's the project we're going to do with that community or for that community or to that community, but instead to say, how could I learn what matters in that community? Who could I call? Who do they know? Who's a leader in that community? How could I listen? How could I be of service so that I start to understand what they value and what matters most to them? And that will really set you up to make a plan for change that is rooted in what actually matters to your community, as opposed to spinning your wheels or just making changes that sound good to you, but may not actually resonate with the community of interest for you. And once you have a plan, then you can, find tools, use tools, get support from others, and make those changes and build that accountability with your community so that the relationship is real and solid. We find that organizations, once you get good at this, it's a muscle you build and you can do it again and again with different communities or with different changes that you want to make. Certainly when I was at the Santa Cruz Museum, we started out doing this with communities who were kind of close in to our experience. But over time, we built the pattern, we built the skills as a team to be able to do this with all kinds of communities at the same time. And so I want to just offer a few very practical steps on how to dive into this, and then we'll go to questions. First, don't rush to make a plan for change first. I know that there is a feeling right now of urgency that, oh my God, people are challenging us about, do we have a plan? We need to have a plan. We are behind. If you are behind, that's fine. Own it. But if you rush to say, and here's exactly what we're going to do, and it's not community informed, you're just going to perpetuate the same problems that you had before. So we really encourage you to start with that vision. And a really simple way you can do that is this, to just spend some time with others, or you can do this on your own with a journal. Just imagine walking in to that organization in 2025 and write a postcard from the future. Tell the story descriptively of who's there, what's going on, how is it different, how are you different, and what do you see? And if you can create some tangibility to that, if you can do a little dreaming of what that might look like, it can set you up then to step backwards and say, okay, what might we need to change to get there? Who might we need to talk with? And who might be a community we want to get started with first? Now is a time where we're so focused on urgent issues. I know I am. And it can be a gift to yourself to just take a little time to dream. And then when it comes to selecting a community, a couple of tips for you here, because this can be quite challenging, as I mentioned, because we all live in places with many, many communities. So we invite you to think about this. Who do you think is critical to the future of your organization? Who, if you were to build a relationship with them, would it change the game of what you're able to do? And one of the ways I like to think about this metaphorically is this. If we imagine all these different communities as sort of bubbles that are out there, some overlapping, but many not, in many ways we live in divided communities right now. Your organization is probably already serving some communities very well. People who love what you do, who feel super welcome, who feel what you do is really relevant and terrific. And that is great. We all have existing communities that we serve. Probably also, perhaps pre-pandemic, you had a couple of communities you were interested in. Maybe you had a teen program at a particular high school, or maybe you were working with composers of color on some new artistic programming. what we've seen during COVID is a lot of organizations have snapped back like this, focusing on their longest term patrons and partners and letting go of some of those new relationships they had been building. And this really worries me because I think when we think about the future of our organizations, this does not lead us to greater relevance. And instead, I think what could be really powerful right now is to look at how could we spend time moving towards those communities who we've been curious about or who we've been trying to change in the direction of for a while. So that after the pandemic's over, our constituency doesn't look like this, but instead might look like this. Let me show you an example of what this might look like in practice. Casa Santa Ana is a Change Network member in Panama City, Panama. They are a small contemporary art center, 1.5 staff members, and they actually had just moved into their space when the pandemic hit. Like a lot of contemporary art centers, they really focused on some communities in particular. They were working with international traveling artists who were doing projects with them and with local art lovers, many of whom were elites. At the same time, Casa Santa Ana is in the Santa Ana neighborhood, a neighborhood that is mostly very working class, very family oriented. And a lot of these folks who were right in the neighborhood were not very connected with Casa Santa Ana. And Casa Santa Ana, the team there said, we will have failed if we become this elite space plopped in this neighborhood. And we need to build these relationships with our neighborhood to be the organization we want to be. And so before the pandemic, they had this, pretty typical setup, right? They had their traditional, their longstanding communities of these traveling artists and these local art lovers, and they were interested in local artists. They were interested in families in the Santa Ana neighborhood. And so they had a school tour program. They'd done one project with local artists, but it had been little bits on the side of what they were doing. But then when the pandemic hit, they decided to move towards their communities of interest. Their traditional communities were, heavily impacted by the pandemic. International artists were not traveling, local art lovers were not coming out, and their communities of interest were heavily impacted as well. People were struggling for access to food and resources and just trying together to survive through a really hard lockdown. And so Casa Santa Ana decided they were going to shift their attention and go all in on learning what mattered to their community of interest and how they could be partners, how they could be good partners. And here are just 2 ways they did that. The first is that they became the first resource offering food assistance in the Santa Ana neighborhood. They stopped raising money for art and they raised tens of thousands of dollars to be able to give away thousands of bags of food in the neighborhood. And in the beginning, they put in the bags these notes that just said, this is from your neighbors at Casa Santa Ana. We love you. Over time, they decided, wait, maybe we can mix this with some art. And they started putting art supplies and starting some guerrilla art projects. There started to be some art exchange where people could go home with art supplies and bring their art back. And they started to encourage also some guerrilla art making, like they gave people flower pots to paint along with seeds, and people were planting plants around the neighborhood in a kind of creative mutual aid. At the same time, they turned their social media account over to local artists and local illustrators in particular, who were documenting the Panamanian experience of the lockdown. And I think in this small way, they're leading themselves down a path where after the pandemic is over, more of those neighbors are going to be curious. They're going to say, I got to know you. I trust you. I'm excited about making art with you. And maybe we can do that together. The last thing I'll note is about making plans for change, specifically about around racial equity, which has been a really important focus over the last several months, and in my opinion, should always be an important focus, but we have urgency right now, so let's use it. If this is something you're talking about in your organization, one tool we would offer you, and I'll put that link in the chat again as well, where you can get the slides, but you can also get this framework for action in response to moments of outrage and crisis. And this is something our team built after the murder of George Floyd, but it's something that you can use when any weird, wild moment happens, which they seem to be falling from the sky frequently these days. And the way it works is this: we encourage you to think about action in two different ways. External action you might do with the public, internal action you might do with your team, and then to look at what you can do immediately and what you can do in the longer term. So, for example, after the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, many organizations felt spurred to act in the immediate, to issue public statements, maybe to do some new programming, partnership with Black artists, maybe to offer some direct support. There were theaters, for example, that decided to open their lobbies to protesters in large cities. And then I just want to note, though, that the external actions were what we all saw publicly, but in a lot of institutions, the internal actions were more important. It can be quite dislocating if you see your organization doing something publicly that they're not doing internally, saying that they see you, saying that they care about you, saying that they want to make room for change. I'll also note, and I feel this very acutely as a leader, when one of these moments come up, we can often feel huge pressure to do something in the immediate, and we often might feel like we're bungling it or doing it wrong, and that perhaps we miss the moment if we don't do something in the first 24 hours. But I would really suggest that these moments are not going away, and they're endemic of a systemic issue. And so there's an opportunity for us to focus on the longer term, for us to say, we may not know what to put on Instagram today, but we know that we want to change our hiring policies. We may not right now be a place that is welcoming and is representative of Black people and people of color, but we know we want to change who we work with and how we work. And in fact, I would really say that the longer term changes you might make, and these are just a couple examples, are going to have greater impact, and they're going to set you up in the future to be able to respond in the immediate with more grace, with more confidence, and with more care for each other. So that resource is available to you if you want it. I want to end with this quote from a member of the Change Network, Vishnu Ramcharan. He's at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto. And when the pandemic started and we were scrambling to change how we were working with folks, he said this beautiful thing to me. He said, I'm trying to take what is given and turn it into a gift. We have been given a lot of hard things in the last year. Some of them we all know about because they exist on a national or an international level, and many of them are very personal challenges people are dealing with. And I think that if amidst some of the challenge, the struggle, the real suffering, and the care for each other, we can look at where the gifts are, where the opportunities are, where suddenly there might be urgency for a change that you've cared about for a long time, where there might suddenly be a rallying point to be able to make something happen. I invite us to think about how we can turn what is given into a gift to build more inclusive, more equitable, more relevant organizations, organizations that truly are of, by, and for all. Thank you. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to stop sharing, and then we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, which is terrific.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and tee off the Q&A portion. It was one of my favorite questions that came in so far, and y'all please throw in your questions. This is a good one. Once you have built relationships with a specific community around a project, how do you maintain those relationships when you've moved on to another project and engaging another area of your community?
Yeah, I would really invite us to think about a metaphor around personal relationships, and to think about the idea that in our personal relationships, yes, we have some people who we call every week. If I don't call my mom almost, every other, anyway, that's my own business. But there are some people who we must be working with at a deep level every single week of the year. But there are also many people in my life who I don't talk to every week. And that doesn't make me less their friend or less compassionate or less interested in supporting and working with them. And so I think if you have a deep relationship through a project, the important thing at the end is to express that desire to work together again, maybe not at that same level of intensity right away, but to say, hey, when we have future opportunities that might be a good fit, we'd love to work with you. Or, hey, if you're ever working with a project and you need support in XYZ, please contact us. One of the things we used to say at the museum, and we would say this with partners as well as visitors, is if we've had a good time, never leave without an invitation to a next thing. And that could be as simple as somebody walking out the door and you say, did you have a nice visit? And they say yes. And you say to them, are you interested in hearing about an event coming up? Or are you interested in getting involved? Or are you an artist? And finding a way to continue that relationship. Similarly with partnerships, we're always looking for, and we're always encouraging our members to look for, what's the next thing that I might want to do with this partner? The next time I have a job open, do I want to contact that partner and say, hey, might you know anybody who would be great for this job? The next time we're having an event and I realize, oh, I know that partner loves live music, I'm just going to invite them down. So how can you think about them like you're building through an intense experience, the kind of friendly relationships that could ebb and flow over time?
That's really great. And I think one thing to punctuate is that you actually deep dive into this in your book. So I would recommend that folks read the book, and they can gain even more insight. Another question I'm thrilled somebody asked is because this is a really common one, particularly in Indiana. So they have a largely white community.
Mhm.
So when they speak of by for all, how does it work for them? Can you explore
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and it's funny. This question comes up all the time in different places, and what I would say is two things. One, diversity takes many forms, and involving new communities does not necessarily have to be along racial lines. You may feel like, oh, we really want to work. We have one member in Northern Ireland who's working with teenagers with mental health issues. We have a member. We have several members working with Native communities. There are members working with homebound seniors in West Texas. So it doesn't have to be racially defined, but I would also encourage you to learn a little bit about your city or your county via, whether it's census data or whether it's, there's a variety of ways to find out. Because often when we say we live in a very white community, it's because maybe I'll just speak for myself personally. I live in a city that is, or I live in a county that's about 30% Latino, and it's about 60% white and about 10% other. But my community that I engage with daily is probably 90% white. And I think a lot of us, we're in a system that divides us. And, I recently was talking about this problem or this question with a group that was in a very rural place, but where there was a huge meatpacking industry, and actually a large percentage of the population was not white, were immigrants, but they were not visible to the cultural experience of white people who were living in a truly different part of the community. And so I think that diversity can take many forms. You can become of, by, and for all the different people who live where you live. But I also encourage you to do a little research and find out who that might be, because you might be surprised when you see the numbers relative to your own lived experience.
There's another question that kind of falls along those lines, and I think this is also one you're probably used to as well, and that revolves around leadership. And leadership is so used to privilege and the power, but shifting into that transformation, how do people navigate that? What advice do you give?
Is this for a leader who is dealing with the power shift question, or is it for a non-leader who's dealing with a leader who won't shift?
I didn't say.
Okay.
So,
All right. Okay. If you're a leader, one thing I really encourage thinking about is how you can shift. I've been kind of starting to work on a next book about leadership and about this idea of shifting from this idea of being a risk taker or being the one who makes the thing to being a space maker, or the one who makes the space for others to flourish and to do their thing. A lot of leadership issues are about control. And frankly, during COVID, I know I, as a leader, because I'm an ED of a small nonprofit, there are times where I feel like what my staff is asking for is that stability and that surety of a benevolent dictator saying, now we have unlimited sick time, or whatever it might be, or your job is okay. And then there are other times where people really feel like, wait a second, how are you making this decision unilaterally? So I do think we're in a confusing time for leaders, because we're being called both to be more open and vulnerable than ever before, and open to power shift, and at the same time being called to make some very hard singular choices. So I think it's a hard time. It's a good time to have at least a little compassion for your leaders. And leaders, it's a good time for you to start to build your skills around shifting and sharing power. And I think that thinking about the question of, who am I accountable to? And what are the opportunities for me to really create space for others to lead? Especially, frankly, leaders are overloaded right now. And so what we're often saying, actually, people often ask us, okay, if we join this change network thing, does our ED need to be on the team, or do they need to be the leader of the team? And we say no. Especially this year, EDs are tapped. And if you are somebody who is excited about this work, feels urgently about this work, there's a big difference. If you can come to your ED and say, hey, I know we've been trying to think about what we're doing around inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, and I think I'm ready to run with that, as opposed to saying, you need to do X or you need to do Y. There's real power in that, both for the person bringing it up to be able to hold some power, and for the leader being able to support and equip that person and make space for that person to have power. But I think, I hope we are entering a time of leadership where there will be greater expectations on leaders of accountability and power sharing. And I think it behooves all of us to learn from whatever positional power we're in, how we are going to hold accountability for that, but also how we're going to show up well in that, and feel, good about ourselves in that. And let me also just finally say, I'm in the midst of a leadership transition out of my organization. I'm caring for a very sick parent, and I have felt strongly that it's important, as a white leader in this cultural space, to really think about how can we, and working with my board on how can this transition happen in a way that shifts more power to people who have had less power in our sector, have had their voice, have not been on these Zoom presentations the way I am often afforded the privilege to do so. And I think that, I assume there's going to be a lot of succession happening in the next year. Leaders are exhausted right now. And so I think that thinking also with boards about how are we going to think about leadership transition in a way that leads us to greater equity and inclusion, and to honoring different kinds of leadership, is going to be really important.
Great. Thank you for that. We have only just a little bit, because I know we have the wrap up time. So I'm just going to hit one of these questions so I don't lose sight of it. Folks are really wondering about, participating in Of, By, For All. And the questions are revolving around sort of government. Has the organization worked with a huge, like a state agency, say something like IAC, or even on the smaller local government sort of level? Have you guys done that? And is there anything sort of unique to that ecosystem?
Yeah, we've worked with libraries, obviously our government entities, parks, and as well as a couple of like state humanities council kind of organizations. I think that what we always say when either an agency, when some kind of agency or government is interested, is we ask, are there communities that you serve? And those communities could be like, for example, the New Jersey Theater Alliance is in our network, and they serve theater and theater makers. They don't serve publics who are coming to the theater. But you need to be in a position to be able to say, yes, we want to focus on, in their case, for example, increasing and expanding opportunities with screenwriters of color or whatever it might be. And so sometimes there are agencies that are at such a remove that they feel like they aren't going to benefit from being able to really talk directly with communities and build partnerships and that kind of thing. And then there are others who feel like, oh yeah, no, that really is relevant to what we do. So that's been a key thing. I would also note, because I've seen a couple of questions about really small organizations, we have seen incredibly small organizations really shine in this work because they tend to be more aligned. It tends to be easier to get everybody in a room or a Zoom room to meet. Um, what we've seen, and this has been kind of surprising, I would say, is that irrespective of size, what matters most is, do you have kind of both the urgency, the why, and some capacity to spend some time doing something that is not the fire that's right in front of you. And I fully respect that many organizations, we just have to deal with the fires that are right in front of us right now. But we've seen, one of our most incredible teams is this 1.5 person staff member organization called Arts Philly that works with people, elderly people with dementia, in partnership, making art together. They've done incredible work in the program, and it's because they've had an attitude and an appetite to be able to make some changes to who they work with. And they felt like they're not 110% full with what they were already doing, but they were open to shift. So it really has not, we've not seen that small organizations are at a disadvantage. We've seen that organizations that don't have capacity to kind of take some energy and put it towards change work, those are the organizations, regardless of what size they are, that don't make the most out of it.
Interesting. One of the other questions that kind of maybe scooting towards our last ones is revolving around working in the time of COVID,
Mhm.
and how are there any wisdom with how to work with new communities, largely online, or how do you do that outreach and stay safe?
Yeah. So, one of the things, so a couple things. One is that one of the beautiful things about COVID is it has made a lot of activities and events that might have been within the context of a church, a community center that might not have been visible. It's made them much more visible. So even your ability to be a listener or to be a volunteer or just to show up to somebody else's performance, event, webinar, meeting, has really become more visible, on places like Facebook. Like if you're curious about a community, it's probably quite easy now. And frankly, might even feel safer. Like we have one group working in the Netherlands with, one of their partners is at a boxing gym, and these young female art workers, I think it's debatable whether they would feel more comfortable walking into the boxing gym or whether they'd feel more comfortable showing up to a boxing gym meetup on Zoom. So I think there are some opportunities that are unique right now. We're also seeing that there's so much more mutual aid activity happening. So it's quite easy, right? We have some members who have said, especially if they are working with a community where there's been no trust or a history, a legacy of some past harm or something bad blood, have said, you know what? We're just going to find out how we can help in that neighborhood right now. And, if there's food delivery to old folks, or there's, some, cleaning the XYZ or whatever, we're going to show up and get to know people in that way. So I think that now is a rare time where there are opportunities to help and more is happening visibly online. It also means we've had some members who are really working with communities with disabilities, and they've seen huge reduction in barriers to participation and changing their own practice. We have a library, for example, who had really previously felt like, gosh, we love doing programs with young adults with disabilities, but how could they ever possibly have a pathway to employment here? And as soon as COVID hit, it changed their thinking about where you needed to be a librarian or to be working with the library constituency. And they started thinking about what could all remote jobs look like that could be a legitimate pathway for some of these terrific volunteers who we've been working with for a long time. So I think just it's different, but trying to be open and thinking about where could we show up and maybe help. Also, just note, I see a lot of great questions in here about defining communities, conflicts within or between communities. Um, I would just say briefly that we recommend being very specific, very narrow in choosing a community. The litmus test I always use in my head is, if you had a magical intern who you could say, go find 10 people in this community I can talk to, would they bring you back the right people? So if, for example, you say, students, and they bring you back high school students, and you were in your head thinking third graders, then you have not been specific enough. Or if you say African Americans, and you're thinking in your head, young professionals who've recently moved to the city, and they're meeting elders in the community who've been there for a long time, those are different communities. And I think one thing people kind of get tripped up on is, just because you start by defining a community narrowly doesn't mean you're only going to serve and work with people who fit that very narrow description. Because probably what you will learn working with a very narrow community will give you insights for changes you can make that will help many others. So for example, there's a historic home in Delaware, a member in the network, who decided to focus on Latinx 20-somethings with an interest in outdoor recreation. Pretty specific, right? But when they talked to some of those folks, they heard things about what might make them feel welcome that made them make some changes. So one change they made, for example, was they had always had security guards wearing a kind of very security guardish uniform and the security officer title. And they heard from these young adults like, hey, that doesn't feel good to me. And they made a change to what that job was and what that uniform was. Now, I think you can probably imagine that when they made that change, that didn't only make Latinx rock climbers who are 25, feel more welcome in their historic home and garden. It made other people feel more welcome too. It's about choosing somebody you're going to really listen to as a starting point for making changes that will probably reduce barriers for others as well.
Is there any other sage advice that you would give, particularly around the don't do this, from your learning curve days?
I guess I would flip that around. And I guess I'll make an assumption. I'm white. I'm sure, and I hope that there are people on this call who are not white, but I assume there are many who are. And I would say that one of the biggest things that stops white people from taking action is a fear we're going to do it wrong. And so what I would say to you is, we all do harm. It doesn't matter what color we are. We do harm by omission. We do harm without knowing it. We do harm intentionally. And so I think the question is not, oh shoot, am I going to screw up and do harm? It's what am I going to learn? And how can I be moving forward in a way that makes me more likely to learn more? So I'm less focused on, am I screwing up, centering myself, and more focused on, what am I learning? What am I changing? What am I making possible? And I think that, one of the things they talk about white supremacy culture is like cult of perfectionism, and this sense that if we can't do it perfectly, like maybe it'll even be worse. No, what's worse is that we've built all these organizations that say they're for the public, but a whole lot of people don't feel welcome. So let's change that. And maybe you'll screw up, and that's okay. But if you're moving in that direction, that will always be better than not moving because you're afraid of saying something wrong or doing something wrong. And the last thing I'll just note, because I know people have a ton of questions, and is that well, first of all, I'll put this link again, and you can share a question there, and we can try and get to some of them. But then also, I'll just note that this Friday, our team is doing an info session about that spring cohort of the Change Network. So if you go to, oh, this is dangerous, I'm trying to imagine what to type. Hold on, let me find this link. But if you want to learn more very specifically about the program, I'll put the link in, and you can hear from my colleague Lauren, who is one of the coaches in the program, and she'll be answering a lot more questions for people who are specifically interested in that Change Network program.
That's great. Thank you. And we will certainly provide those links in our follow-up email to everybody that registered to attend. That was one of the value adds of registration is that we get your email address so we could share that information. Nina, this has been so fantastic. My team, I know I've gotten lots of hearts from the Teams app. Just thrilled to have this opportunity to learn from you. And folks, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. And we will post the recording of this webinar and the resources. Also, information about our upcoming virtual book club, where you can come geek out with Megan and I to chat about Nina's amazing book, The Art of Relevance. We know you'll be inspired to read. And y'all, I cannot recommend this book enough. Like I told Nina earlier, I was rereading it in preparation. I was like, oh my gosh, I almost forgot how awesome this is. So highly encourage you to read that book. Megan?
I can't wait for to geek out with you, Paige. It'll be fun. And I invite you all to join us for that. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And I just want to encourage us to give one more big virtual round of applause for Nina. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Have a great day. Go out and make some change. All right. Take care.